In the golden pages of antiquity, when the divine and the profane wove an eternal clash, a pure soul had to prove its worth. In a single day of tears, fire kissed the earth, winds carried dreams, shadows embraced the light, and pain blossomed like a wild garden. But from the deepest valley arose a melody that pierced the heavens, with words that made angels stop to listen, and the accuser retreat in silence.
Though he slay me, and yet will I trust in him.
And from the storm came the calm. From the lament came the joy. From the trial emerged a faith that not only turned ashes into pure gold, but proved for all eternity that some souls are truly indestructible. In the arid lands that stretch beyond the borders of Edom, where the sun rises painting the rocky hills with gold and the wind whispers ancient stories through the valleys, there lived a man whose name echoed like legend among the tribes of the East. Job, son of the land of Uz, was not merely a man. He was a force of nature, a colossus of virtue and prosperity who dominated that region like a king without a crown. His domains spread for leagues, a vastness of verdant pastures where the echo of bleating and lowing created a pastoral symphony that reached the heavens. 7,000 sheep, white as scattered clouds, moved in gentle waves across the slopes, their wool gleaming under the morning sun like pure silk. The 3,000 camels he possessed were the envy of the richest merchants in all of Arabia. Majestic creatures with proud necks and intelligent gazes, they carried Job's riches through the trade routes that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia. The eldest son, strong as a lion and wise as a serpent, had learned from his father the art of fair commerce and compassionate leadership. The second son possessed a natural gift for agriculture, transforming every piece of land he touched into prosperous gardens. The third was known for his skill in training animals and his courage in defending them from predators. Each of the 7 sons had developed unique talents, but all shared the same moral integrity that was the trademark of Job's family. Job's 3 daughters were celebrated throughout the land not only for their extraordinary beauty, which rivaled the stars in the night sky, but for their sharp intelligence and generous hearts. Their names were whispered with admiration in markets and tents, women who honored their father's name not only with their dazzling appearance, but with their practical wisdom and genuine kindness. The eldest daughter was known for her skill in weaving the most beautiful carpets in the region, the second for her melodious voice that calmed even the most troubled hearts, and the youngest for her compassion toward the poor and needy. It was customary among the brothers to hold rotating banquets, a sacred tradition that strengthened family bonds and demonstrated the unbreakable unity of Job's house. Each day of the week, one of the sons would open the doors of his house, and all the brothers and sisters would gather to celebrate not only the prosperity that God had granted them, but also the love that united them like a golden chain. The tables were abundant, covered with the finest delicacies of the land: roasted lambs seasoned with aromatic herbs, fresh breads that still exhaled the warmth of ovens, succulent fruits that dripped sweetness, and aged wines that gladdened the heart without intoxicating the mind. But what truly distinguished Job from all other wealthy men of his time were not his material possessions, however impressive they might be. It was his irreproachable character, his integrity that shone brighter than gold refined 7 times in fire. Every morning, even before the sun rose and painted the horizon with its first golden rays, Job would awaken and walk to the stone altar he had built at the highest point of his lands. There, while the world still slept in silence and only the stars witnessed his devotion, he offered burnt offerings to God, not only for his own sins, but for the sins his children might have committed during their joyful banquets. "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts," he would murmur as the fire consumed the chosen sacrifices, and the smoke rose like pure incense to the distant heavens. This paternal concern, this constant spiritual vigilance, revealed the oceanic depth of his faith. Job was not merely prosperous, he was blameless, upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil like a wise man turns away from a venomous serpent. His reputation spread like precious perfume through the desert winds, reaching the ears of distant kings and sages from far lands who came seeking his counsel. In the heavenly places, where eternity meets time and divine glory shines more intense than 1,000 suns, an extraordinary day was being announced by the music of the spheres. It was the sacred moment when the sons of God presented themselves before the throne of the Most High. an assembly that transcended all human understanding and gathered the most magnificent beings of creation. Heaven opened like a vast amphitheater of liquid crystal, where each ray of light carried songs of praise and each breath of celestial wind whispered worship to the Creator. Myriads of angels, seraphim and cherubim moved in perfect formations, their wings creating visual harmonies that danced in the air like eternal aurora borealis. Their faces shone with light reflected from the divine presence, and their voices joined in choirs that made the foundations of the universe vibrate in worship. At the center of this infinite majesty, the throne of the Most High rose like a mountain of pure light, surrounded by a rainbow that contained all existing colors and many others that mortal eyes had never beheld. From there emanated a presence that was both terrible and wonderful, just and merciful, powerful beyond all measure yet intimately personal. It was before this throne that the sons of God came to give account of their cosmic ministries. But when it seemed that all the heavenly servants had presented themselves, a different presence materialized in the sacred assembly. It was a figure that contrasted dramatically with the pure light around, not complete darkness, but something more disturbing, corrupted light, brilliance that had lost its original purity. Satan, the adversary, he who had chosen rebellion instead of submission, walked among the sons of God with the arrogance of one who believes he has discovered a flaw in creation's perfect system. His presence created a tense silence in the heavenly assembly. The angels recoiled instinctively, not from fear but from natural repulsion toward the presence of evil. Satan, however, advanced with disturbing confidence, as if he still had the right to be there, as if his rebellion had not changed his fundamental position in the cosmos. The voice of the Most High echoed through eternity, carrying within it the power that had spoken worlds into existence and the authority that sustains every atom in the universe. From where do you come? The question was not asked from ignorance. The omniscient God knows the whereabouts of every creature at every moment, but rather as a challenge, an opportunity for the adversary to reveal his intentions before the entire heavenly court. Satan responded with the insolence that had become his trademark, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. His words carried a tone of disturbing ownership, as if the earth were his personal domain, his hunting ground, where he had total freedom to pursue and tempt the creatures made in God's image. There was a sinister implication in his response. He had been busy, very busy, observing, analyzing, searching for weaknesses in human faith. It was then that the divine voice pronounced words that cut through satanic arrogance like a sword of fire. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. The pride in the divine voice was unmistakable. It was not the sinful pride that characterizes fallen creatures, but the righteous satisfaction of a creator who sees his work achieve its intended perfection. Job was presented not merely as a good man, but as a masterpiece of divine grace, a living example of what humanity could be when it chooses to serve God with complete integrity. The mention of Job's name provoked an instant change in Satan's posture. His eyes narrowed with calculated malice, and a cruel smile curved his lips. Here was the opportunity he had been waiting for, the chance to prove his most cherished theory about human nature. For ages he had argued that human faithfulness to God was fundamentally selfish, based only on blessings received and not on genuine love. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan's question echoed through the heavens like spreading poison, carrying within it centuries of bitterness and rebellion. It was more than a question. It was a direct accusation against God's very nature and the validity of human faith. Satan was suggesting that all of Job's devotion was a farce, a performance motivated only by the prosperity God had poured out on his life. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. Satan's words gained momentum, like a storm forming on the horizon. He was painting a picture of Job's faith as something completely transactional, a business contract, where God paid with blessings and Job responded with worship. And then came the challenge that would change everything. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. It was a cosmic wager, an experiment that would test not only Job's faith, but the very nature of the relationship between creator and creature. Satan was betting his very existence on the theory that humanity, was fundamentally selfish, that removing divine blessings would reveal the true corrupt nature of the human heart. It was his opportunity to prove he was right about God and humanity, that all love was conditional, all faith was mercenary, all devotion was bought. Finally, the voice of the Most High broke the silence with words that sealed Job's fate. "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Permission was granted. The most terrible experiment in human history was authorized. Satan had received carte blanche to destroy everything Job loved and possessed, with only one restriction: Job's own life must be preserved. The sun rose as always over the lands of Uz, painting the horizon with golden and crimson hues, revealing no omen of the darkness approaching. It was a day like any other in Job's prosperous life. The flocks moved lazily through the verdant pastures, servants began their daily tasks with the efficiency born of routine, and Job himself observed his domains from the terrace of his house, breathing the fresh morning air and feeling deep gratitude in his heart for all the blessings God had poured out on his life. Job's children had gathered at the eldest son's house for another of their traditional family banquets. It was the eldest son's turn to organize the celebration, and his house had been prepared with the care and attention to detail that characterized all family gatherings. The tables were abundant, covered with the finest foods the earth could offer, and wine flowed freely as brothers and sisters shared stories, laughter, and plans for the future. The sound of their joyful voices echoed through the courtyards, creating an atmosphere of contagious joy that seemed to bless the entire surrounding environment. Job smiled, thinking of his children gathered together, but soon his mind turned to the day's responsibilities. There were commercial matters to resolve, caravans to organize, and always the constant supervision of the flocks that were the foundation of his wealth. He descended from the terrace and walked through his domains, greeting servants and checking on the animals' welfare with the care of a true shepherd. It was almost noon when Job spotted a figure running desperately toward his house. It was one of his youngest servants, a boy who normally tended the oxen and donkeys in the most distant fields. The young man ran as if fleeing from hell itself, his bare feet raising clouds of dust, his gasping lungs struggling for air, his eyes wide with pure terror. His garments were torn, stained with blood, and on his face was engraved an expression of horror that made Job's heart tighten with terrible foreboding. The servant threw himself at Job's feet, trembling uncontrollably, struggling to form words between sobs of desperation. "Master, master!" he cried, his voice broken by emotion and exhaustion from the desperate run. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby when the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. The words struck Job like lightning in a clear sky. The Sabaeans, those nomadic bandits who lived by plunder and violence, had attacked his herds. 500 yoke of oxen, 1,000 donkeys, and worse still, precious human lives had been lost. Faithful men who had served his family for years, who had their own families and dreams, had been murdered in cold blood by merciless raiders. Without even waiting for Job to recover from the first shock, the second messenger threw himself to the ground and cried with a hoarse voice, "The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. 7,000 sheep, all dead in an instant by supernatural fire that had descended from the heavens like divine judgment." The shepherds Job had known since childhood, men whose faithfulness had been tested through years of loyal service, had perished along with the flocks. The fire had been so intense and swift that there had been no time for escape or rescue. In minutes, an entire fortune had been transformed into ashes and charcoal. Job's heart hammered in his chest like war drums, two impossible tragedies in a matter of minutes. But before he could fully process what was happening, a third servant appeared, running from the pastures where the camels were kept. His clothes were blood-stained, one sleeve had been completely torn off, and a deep wound on his forehead bled profusely, covering half his face with a red veil. "The Chaldeans," he shouted before even reaching Job's feet. "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." Job staggered, feeling as if the very ground was moving beneath his feet. In less than an hour, he had lost practically all his material wealth. It was then that he spotted a fourth figure approaching, coming from the direction of his eldest son's house. This time, it was not one of his servants, but one of the servants from his son's house, an older man who had served the family for decades. He came stumbling, not running, as if each step were a supreme effort. His clothes were covered with dust and debris, and in his eyes was an expression of trauma so deep that Job felt his blood freeze in his veins. The man approached slowly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a broken whisper that carried the weight of an indescribable tragedy. "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed on them and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." Job imagined the terrible scene, his sons and daughters, moments before laughing and celebrating together, sharing food and stories in an atmosphere of love and family joy. And then, without warning, the monstrous wind roaring through the desert, striking the house with irresistible force, the walls collapsing, the heavy beams falling on those he loved most in the world. In seconds, a celebration of life had been transformed into a collective tomb. The last messenger collapsed at Job's feet, exhausted by the journey and by the trauma of having witnessed the tragedy. Job remained standing for a moment that seemed like eternity, his body trembling not from fear, but from the pure shock of a loss so devastating it defied all human understanding. Then, in a gesture that would echo through the centuries as a symbol of profound mourning, Job tore his robe. The sound of fabric tearing cut through the air like a silent cry of anguish. Next, he shaved his head, removing the hair that was a symbol of his dignity and position, leaving his skull bare as an external expression of the emptiness that now inhabited his soul. But what happened next surprised even the angels watching from heaven. Instead of cursing God or rebelling against the cruel fate that had destroyed his life in a single morning, Job fell to the ground and worshipped. With his face to the ground, covered with dust and tears, he pronounced words that would become an eternal testament of human faith in the face of inexplicable suffering. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." The words came from his lips like a prayer born from the depths of the human soul, a declaration of faith that transcended all logic and all natural expectation. Here was a man who had lost everything, wealth, children, future, and yet found strength to bless the name of God. The heavenly court assembled once more, but this time there was a different tension in the sacred air. The angels, who had witnessed the first phase of Job's test with respectful horror, now watched with growing admiration. The faithful servant of God's response to total tragedy had echoed through the heavens like a hymn of victory, living proof that genuine faith can survive even the complete destruction of earthly prosperity. Satan entered the divine assembly with steps that tried to disguise his defeat, but which revealed the growing bitterness consuming his rebellious being. His appearance had become even darker, as if his failure to corrupt Job had intensified his own moral degradation. He had profoundly underestimated the nature of true faith, and this discovery left him more dangerous than ever, like a wounded beast that attacks with desperate fury. The voice of the Most High echoed again through eternity, but this time carried a tone of triumph that made the foundations of the cosmos vibrate with joy. "Where have you come from?" It was the same question from the previous assembly, but now it carried a different weight. It was not just a challenge, but an opportunity for Satan to admit his defeat before the entire heavenly court. "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it," came the familiar response, but this time pronounced with less arrogance and more poorly disguised irritation. Satan had spent the days since the first tragedy obsessively watching Job, searching for some sign of a crack in his faith, some evidence that his theory about human nature was still correct. To his growing frustration, Job had remained firm as a rock in the midst of the storm. It was then that the divine voice pronounced words that cut through Satan's rebellious soul like purifying fire. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." The repetition of Job's description was not merely rhetorical, it was a declaration of victory. God was proclaiming that, even after losing everything, Job remained exactly what he had always been: blameless, upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. The final phrase, "he still maintains his integrity," was particularly devastating to Satan, as it completely destroyed his theory that Job's faith was mercenary. Even more painful were the words, "Though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." God was making clear that the destruction of Job's possessions had truly been without any reason. There was nothing in Job that justified such suffering. It was a divine admission that Job was genuinely innocent, which made his continued faithfulness even more extraordinary, and Satan's defeat even more complete. But Satan, consumed by his obsession to prove his cynical view of humanity, could not accept defeat. Like an addicted gambler who loses everything but continues betting, he doubled down with an even more desperate proposal. Skin for skin, a man will give all he has for his own life. These words revealed the depth of his incomprehension about truly redeemed human nature. Satan was arguing that although Job had endured the loss of possessions and even children, there was still a line he would not cross: self-preservation. The adversary believed that touching Job's physical health, threatening his very life, would finally reveal the selfishness he was certain existed in the heart of every human being. Skin for skin was a commercial expression of the time, referring to the practice of trading one commodity for another of equivalent value. Satan was suggesting that Job had been willing to trade his possessions and even his children for the preservation of his own life, but that when that life was threatened, he would reveal his true selfish nature. The silence that followed was even deeper than that of the previous assembly. The angels watched with growing horror, not at the possibility that Job might fail, but at the pure evil being revealed in Satan's heart. They were witnessing the escalation of a conflict that went far beyond a test of faith. It was a battle for the very definition of human nature and divine character. Finally, the voice of the Most High pronounced the words that would seal the second phase of the most terrible test in history. "Behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life." Permission was granted again, but this time with an even more terrible scope. Satan had received authorization to attack Job's very body, to inflict any physical suffering he desired, with only one restriction: Job's life must be preserved. It was like giving an artist a blank canvas and all the colors of suffering, asking him to create a masterpiece of agony. The stakes had been doubled, the test had intensified, and in the distant land, Job continued his life of renewed faith after the first tragedy, completely unaware that an even more terrible storm was forming on the horizon of his existence. The next phase of the cosmic conflict was about to begin, and this time the battlefield would be the very body of the most upright man on earth. Dawn came silently over the devastated lands of Uz, but brought with it a sinister change in the air. There was an oppressive quality to the atmosphere, as if the very sky was charged with malignant omens. Job awoke in his empty house, which now echoed with the deafening silence of his children's absence, feeling a strange tingling sensation on his skin, as if thousands of invisible needles were pricking every pore of his body. Initially, he thought it was merely the result of the devastating emotional stress of recent days. Grief had settled in his soul like a weight that made every breath a conscious effort. His nights were filled with nightmares, where he heard his children's voices calling for help, only to awaken to the cruel reality that they were gone forever. His days were an endless succession of painful memories and tears that seemed to spring from an inexhaustible fountain of sorrow. But when the first rays of sun touched his skin, Job realized that something terrible was happening to his body. Small lesions began to appear on his arms, initially as red spots he mistook for insect bites. However, within minutes, these marks transformed into open wounds that began to ooze a yellowish, foul-smelling liquid. The horror spread like wildfire. From the tips of his toes to his scalp, malignant sores sprouted like poisonous mushrooms after a pestilent rain. There wasn't a single centimeter of healthy skin on his entire body. Every portion of his flesh had become a map of pain and putrefaction. The wounds were not merely superficial, they deepened until they seemed to touch his very bones, creating craters of agony that pulsed with pain that defied all description. The odor that emanated from his body became so repugnant that even the few servants who had remained faithful began to distance themselves from him. It was a smell of death in life, of flesh rotting while still pulsing with blood, a nauseating combination of pus, coagulated blood, and something deeper and more terrible, the very smell of satanic curse impregnated in every cell of his being. It was when the situation became truly desperate that Job made a decision that would become one of the most powerful symbols of human suffering. He abandoned the comfort of his house, which now seemed to him a prison of painful memories, and headed to the ash heap on the outskirts of the city. It was in this deplorable state that his wife found him, the woman who had shared his prosperity, who had been mother to his 10 beloved children, who had enjoyed a life of luxury and honor as consort to the richest man in the East. Now she looked at what remained of her husband with a mixture of horror, disgust, and something even more terrible, total despair. She approached hesitantly, covering her nose with a cloth to block the terrible odor emanating from him. Her eyes, which had once shone with love and admiration, now reflected only disgust and a deep bitterness that had grown since the death of their children. The loss of their 10 children had broken something fundamental in her soul, and seeing her husband reduced to this subhuman state was the final drop that destroyed any faith that might have remained in her heart. "Do you still retain your integrity?" she said, her voice laden with bitter sarcasm and despair. "Curse God and die." The words came from her mouth like distilled poison, each syllable a stab in Job's already shattered heart. It was the cruelest possible suggestion at the moment of greatest vulnerability, that he should abandon the only thing he had left, his faith, and seek the final relief of death through blasphemy that would surely attract immediate divine judgment. But even in his deplorable state, even with every fiber of his being screaming in pain, even with his mind clouded by constant suffering, Job found strength to respond with a dignity that transcended his physical condition. "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" It was a response that revealed the oceanic depth of his faith. Here was a man who had been reduced to the lowest possible state of human existence, rejected even by his own wife, and yet refused to abandon his trust in God. He recognized that accepting divine blessings also meant accepting the painful mysteries that God allowed in his life. His wife walked away in silence, unable to comprehend or bear her husband's unshakable faith. She had chosen bitterness as her companion, while Job chose to remain faithful to the God he did not understand, but in whom he still trusted. The days passed slowly, each one an eternity of physical agony and psychological torture. Job had become a living symbol of human fragility, and paradoxically of the extraordinary resistance that faith can provide, even in the most desperate circumstances. News of the disaster that had befallen Job spread through the commercial routes of the East like fire in dry straw. Merchants who knew his legendary prosperity carried the terrible story from city to city, from tribe to tribe, each account more dramatic than the last. The man who had been known as the most prosperous and upright in all the region had lost everything in a matter of days: his riches, his children, and now, according to increasingly somber rumors, was slowly dying from a horrible disease that had transformed his body into a putrid ruin. In 3 distant regions, 3 men who had been intimate friends of Job during years of prosperity received this news with profound shock and genuine sadness. They were men of position and wisdom, respected leaders in their own communities, who had developed deep bonds with Job through years of commercial partnership, mutual consultation, and true friendship. Eliphaz the Temanite was the eldest of the 3, a man with gray hair and penetrating eyes who had accumulated decades of experience in the art of Eastern wisdom. Born in Teman, a city famous for its wise men and philosophers, he had dedicated himself from youth to the study of ancestral traditions and understanding the ways of God. Bildad the Shuhite was a middle-aged man known for his unwavering loyalty to ancestral traditions and his exceptional ability to preserve and transmit ancestral wisdom. He came from the land of Shuah, where the stories of the patriarchs were kept as sacred treasures and transmitted from generation to generation with religious reverence. Zophar the Naamathite was the youngest of the 3, a vigorous and eloquent man who had made his fortune through a combination of sharp intelligence and tireless work. Originally from Naamah, a prosperous region known for its skilled craftsmen and astute merchants, he represented the new generation of leaders who combined traditional wisdom with innovative methods. By extraordinary synchronicity, the 3 men made the same decision almost simultaneously: to leave their responsibilities and travel to Uz to comfort their friend in his hour of greatest need. Without communicating with each other, each began his journey, bringing with him servants, provisions, and gifts they hoped might bring some comfort to the man who had lost everything. The journey to Uz took several days for each of them, days filled with memories of better times and anguishing speculations about what had really happened. During the long hours on the road, They mentally revisited their last conversations with Job, searching for signs or omens that might have predicted such calamity. Each developed his own theories about the causes of the tragedy, based on their theological perspectives and particular life experiences. By another notable synchronism, all three arrived near Uz almost at the same time, meeting on the roads that converged toward the city. The reunion was bittersweet, the joy of seeing each other again being immediately tempered by the sadness of the reason that had brought them together. They decided to travel together for the final miles, strengthening each other for what promised to be an extremely painful encounter. As they approached the city, they began asking questions of travelers and merchants they met along the way. The answers they received were increasingly disturbing. Yes, it was true that Job had lost all his riches. Yes, it was true that all his children had died tragically. And yes, Job himself was now covered with terrible sores and lived as a pariah in the ash heap outside the city. When they finally caught sight of the city of Uz on the horizon, their hearts tightened with anxious anticipation. They asked for directions to the ash heap, and local residents pointed toward a desolate area on the outskirts of the city, warning them about the horrible state in which they would find their friend. Some even suggested it would be better not to approach, due to the terrible odor and possibility of contagion, but the loyalty and genuine love they felt for Job overcame any personal consideration of safety or comfort. They headed determinedly toward the ash heap, mentally preparing themselves for a reunion they knew would be devastating, but necessary. What they saw when they finally reached the place exceeded their worst expectations. Sitting on a pile of ashes, scraping his sores with a piece of broken pottery, was a figure they could barely recognize as their friend. The man who had once been the very image of prosperity and vibrant health was now a grotesque specter of pain and physical degradation. Job was unrecognizable. His face, once noble and radiant, was now so disfigured by sores that his very features had been obscured. His eyes, which used to shine with intelligence and kindness, were now sunken and surrounded by suppurating wounds. His body, which had been strong and imposing, was now skeletal and covered with ulcers that seemed to move and pulse with their own life. The odor emanating from him was so intense that the three friends instinctively stepped back several paces, covering their noses with their garments. It wasn't just the smell of disease, but something deeper and more disturbing, as if the very essence of death was impregnated in every pore of his skin. For several minutes they remained in absolute silence, struggling to process the shocking transformation that had occurred in their friend. The contrast between the Job they knew, prosperous, healthy, surrounded by family and honor, and the devastated creature they now saw before them was so extreme that it seemed impossible they were the same person. Finally, the reality of the situation hit them with full force, and they could no longer contain their emotion. Simultaneously, the three men raised their voices in a lament that echoed through the ash heap like a chorus of pure sorrow. They wept not only for their friend's terrible physical condition, but for the apparent injustice of what had happened to a man they knew to be fundamentally good. Then, following traditional mourning customs, they tore their garments and threw dust upon their heads, transforming themselves into figures of sorrow and solidarity with their friend's suffering. It was a powerful demonstration of genuine empathy, a gesture that communicated they were willing to share, at least symbolically, the humiliation and pain Job was experiencing. Then they did something that revealed the depth of their compassion. They sat on the ground beside Job, in the same ashes that surrounded him, willing to share his degraded condition. For 7 full days and 7 nights, they remained seated in silence beside their suffering friend. It was a silence charged with meaning. It was not the absence of communication, but the presence of a communion deeper than words. They instinctively understood that there were no adequate words for the magnitude of suffering Job was experiencing. Any attempt at premature explanation or consolation would be a trivialization of his pain. During those 7 days, a growing tension accumulated in the air. Each of the 3 friends internally developed their own theories about what had caused Job's calamity, and each struggled with deep theological questions about the nature of divine justice and human suffering. But they kept their reflections to themselves, respecting Job's need to process his pain in silence. The silence would finally be broken by Job himself, but when that happened, it would mark the beginning of one of the deepest and most challenging dialogues about faith, suffering, and divine justice ever recorded in human history. The three friends had come to console, but would end up becoming involuntary participants in a cosmic drama that would test not only Job's faith, but also their own understandings about the nature of God and human suffering. The seventh day arrived with a silence that had become almost unbearable. For an entire week, the four men had remained seated in the ashes like statues of sorrow, united in a mourning that transcended words. The air around them was heavy, not only with the odor of Job's wounds, but with the accumulated weight of unformulated questions, unexpressed theories, and a growing tension that pressed against the limits of respectful silence. Job had spent those 7 days on an internal journey through the darkest valleys of the human soul. His mind, when not clouded by constant physical pain, wandered through labyrinths of memory and questioning. He mentally reviewed every moment of his prosperous life, every decision he had made, every sacrifice he had offered, desperately searching for some explanation for the nightmare his existence had become. The nights were especially torturous. When darkness descended upon the ash heap, and the only sounds were the occasional moan that escaped his lips and the whispers of the three friends shifting position in the cold ashes, Job found himself confronted with the absolute emptiness of his new reality. There were no more voices of children laughing, no more the comforting movement of servants caring for his house, no more the reassuring sound of flocks grazing in his fields. It was on the morning of the 8th day that something within Job finally broke. Not his faith, that remained like a weak but persistent flame amid the ruins of his life, but his capacity to contain the torrent of anguish that had accumulated in his soul like water behind a dam. The pressure had become unbearable, and words began to spring from his lips like a fountain bursting from the earth. Initially, they were just inarticulate moans, primitive sounds of pain that came from the depths of his being. His three friends started at hearing Job's first vocalization in 8 days, looking anxiously to see if he was about to speak. But when words finally came, they carried a weight of desperation that made their hearts constrict even more. Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. Job's voice was hoarse from prolonged silence and constant pain, but carried an emotional intensity that cut through the morning air like a blade. These were not words of curse against God, but something perhaps even more disturbing, a curse against his own existence. The words continued to flow like a river of poetic lamentation. Let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. It was a language of cosmic devastation, as if Job were asking the very universe to undo the moment of his conception. He wanted the day of his birth to be retroactively removed from the calendar of creation, to become a black void in the chronology of time, a hole in reality where not even divine light could penetrate. His three friends listened in horrified silence as Job continued his lamentation, each word revealing the oceanic depth of his despair. He spoke of the night of his conception as if it were a moment of cosmic crime. As for that night, let darkness seize upon it. Let it not be joined unto the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Lo, let that night be solitary. Let no joyful voice come therein. Let them curse it that curse the day, who are ready to raise up their mourning. The image of Leviathan, the mythical creature of primordial chaos, revealed that Job was invoking forces of total disorder to undo his own existence. It was as if he wanted to summon chaos itself to swallow the moment when his life began. Why died I not from the womb? Why did I not give up the ghost when I came out of the belly? Why did the knees prevent me? Or why the breasts that I should suck? Each question was a stab in his own heart, an existential questioning that went to the very core of the reason for being. Job painted vivid images of how it would have been better never to have existed. For now should I have lain still and been quiet, I should have slept. Then had I been at rest, with kings and counselors of the earth, which built desolate places for themselves, or with princes that had gold, who filled their houses with silver. It was a somber fantasy of peace in death, where he could rest alongside the great ones of the earth who had already departed. Death was presented not as terror, but as relief, a refuge from the constant agony that had become his life, or as an hidden untimely birth I had not been, as infants which never saw light. There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary be at rest. There the prisoners rest together. They hear not the voice of the oppressor. The small and great are there, and the servant is free from his master. The progression of his images was devastating, from kings to prisoners, from great to small, all united in the final equality of death. For Job, in his state of torment, death had become the great equalizer, the place where all pain ceases and all injustice is silenced. And then came the question that would echo through the centuries like a cry from the human soul in suffering. Why is light given to the miserable and life to the bitter of soul? Who wait for death, but it does not come, and they dig for it more than for hidden treasures? Who would greatly rejoice and exult if they found the grave? It was the cruel paradox of a life that had become worse than death, where the continuation of existence was more terrible than its cessation. Job was articulating the despair of all those who reach the point where life becomes an unbearable burden, but death remains elusive. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in on every side? The final question was perhaps the most devastating, for it revealed that Job felt as if God had surrounded him, not with protection, but with a prison of suffering from which there was no escape. When Job finally stopped speaking, a silence even deeper than the previous one descended upon the ash heap. His three friends had been confronted with an expression of human despair so pure and devastating that it left their own souls shaken. They had come to comfort, but now found themselves before an abyss of suffering that challenged all their concepts about faith, justice, and divine purpose. Job's lament had broken the silence, but had created something even more challenging: the need for an answer. As loyal friends, they could not simply let these words echo without contestation. As men of faith, they felt they needed to defend divine justice against what they perceived as dangerous questionings. The dialogue that was about to begin would test not only Job's faith, but also the wisdom and compassion of his friends, revealing the limitations of human wisdom when confronted with the mysteries of divine suffering. Job's devastating lament had created a vacuum that demanded response. Eliphaz the Temanite, as the oldest and most experienced of the three friends, assumed the responsibility of breaking the heavy silence that had settled after his friend's desperate words. His voice, cultivated through decades of wisdom and teaching, cut through the morning air with the authority of one who believes he possesses divine answers to the deepest questions of human existence. "If we attempt to speak to you, will you be weary?" "But who can restrain words?" began Eliphaz, his approach initially gentle but loaded with unquestionable confidence in his own wisdom. He proceeded to paint a picture of the theology of retribution that had dominated the religious thought of his era, the firm belief that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked in direct and proportional manner. Remember now, what innocent person ever perished, and where were the upright destroyed? Eliphaz's words carried the mathematical certainty of one who believes he has unraveled the fundamental laws governing the moral universe. For him, Job's suffering was irrefutable evidence of hidden sin, for in his theology there was no room for the suffering of the truly innocent. Then Eliphaz revealed his most powerful card, a nocturnal vision he had received, wrapped in mystery and supernatural terror. Then a word was spoken to me in secret, and my ears perceived a whisper of it. Among thoughts from visions of the night, when deep sleep falls upon men, fear and trembling came upon me, which made all my bones shake. The description of his mystical experience was vivid and terrifying, a spirit passing before his face, the hair of his flesh standing up, a voice whispering cosmic truths. Can a man be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his Maker? Job listened to Eliphaz's words with a mixture of sadness and growing indignation. When his turn came to respond, his words came out loaded with bitter irony that revealed how deeply he felt misunderstood by those he had considered his closest friends. "Truly you are the people, and wisdom will die with you." The sarcasm was unmistakable, a direct rejection of the intellectual arrogance he perceived in Eliphaz's words. Job did not deny divine sovereignty, but questioned the simplistic application of retribution theology to his specific case. "Miseries upon miseries have happened to me, and my groans have no weight." Job articulated his desire for death not as blasphemy, but as a natural longing for relief from suffering that had exceeded all limits of human endurance. It was the cry of a man who had reached the end of his strength, but not of his faith. Bildad the Shuhite then intervened with the authority of ancestral tradition. His approach was different from Eliphaz's. Where the latter relied on personal revelation, Bildad appealed to the accumulated wisdom of generations. Ask now of the past generations, and prepare yourself for the inquiry of their fathers. For we are but of yesterday and know nothing, because our days on earth are like a shadow. For Bildad, the answer to Job's problems was clearly established in traditional wisdom that had been tested through centuries. God was just, the ancestors were wise, and therefore Job's suffering had to have an identifiable moral cause. Job's response to Bildad revealed a growing tension between his recognition of divine sovereignty and his personal experience of apparent injustice. Truly I know that it is so, but how can a man be justified before God? If he wants to contend with him, he cannot answer him one time out of 1,000. It was an admission of human limitation before divine power, but also a subtle critique of his friend's simplistic theology. Job recognized that God was too powerful to be effectively questioned, but this did not resolve the moral problem of his undeserved suffering. Zophar the Naamathite was the most direct and cruel of the three. His youth and confidence manifested in a fierce criticism of Job's words. Should not the multitude of words be answered? And should a talkative man be justified? Should your lies make men silent? And will you mock without anyone confounding you? Zophar directly accused Job of hypocrisy and arrogance, demanding that he repent of sins he was certain existed, even if hidden. But oh, if God would speak and open his lips against you and make known to you the secrets of wisdom, then you would see that God requires of you less than your iniquity deserves. Job's response to Zophar was loaded with devastating irony that revealed his growing frustration with his friend's incomprehension. Truly, you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you, and who does not know such things as these? As the debate continued, positions hardened and accusations became more personal. The three friends, frustrated by Job's refusal to accept their theological explanations, intensified their attacks, moving from veiled suggestions to direct accusations of specific sin. Eliphaz returned with harder arguments, suggesting that Job had become arrogant in his prosperity and was now receiving deserved divine correction. Bildad appealed more emphatically to examples of ancestors, insisting that history was full of cases that proved his theory of divine retribution. Zophar was even more direct, practically demanding that Job confess specific sins he was certain existed, but it was in Job's response during this second round that one of the most powerful declarations of faith ever recorded in human literature emerged. Even when he felt completely abandoned by God and misunderstood by men, he pronounced words that would become a beacon of hope for all who suffer. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. However, I will defend my ways before him. It was a paradoxical declaration of absolute faith in the midst of absolute despair. Job was saying that even if God killed him, and at that moment it seemed that was exactly what was happening, he would continue trusting in him. It was faith not based on circumstances or rewards, but on God's very nature. During this phase, Job also articulated his desperate desire for a mediator, someone who could arbitrate between him and God. There is no mediator between us who might lay his hand on us both. It was a prophetic cry that would echo through the centuries, revealing the fundamental human need for someone who could represent humanity before God. The third and final round of debates brought the conflict to its climax. Eliphaz completely abandoned diplomacy and listed specific sins he accused Job of having committed: oppression of the poor, denial of water to the thirsty, cruelty toward orphans and widows. These were completely false accusations, based not on evidence, but on the theological necessity to find explanation for Job's suffering. Bildad and Zophar followed with similar accusations, creating an atmosphere of fierce accusation that left Job not only physically devastated, but also socially crucified by those who had supposedly come to comfort him. It was at this moment of greatest despair that Job pronounced perhaps the most famous words of his entire story: "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at last he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God." It was a declaration of faith that completely transcended his present circumstances. Even when his body was being consumed by disease, even when his friends had abandoned him, even when God seemed silent, Job affirmed his unshakable confidence that there would be a Redeemer, someone who would vindicate him and allow him to see God face to face. The theological depth of this declaration was extraordinary. Job was anticipating not only personal vindication, but also direct divine revelation. It was an expression of faith that went beyond the retribution theology his friends defended, reaching dimensions of hope that transcended present life. After this monumental declaration, the three friends finally fell silent. They had no more arguments. Job's faith had proven deeper than all their combined wisdom, his hope stronger than all their accusations. They had come to comfort him with their theology, but discovered that his faith was more solid than all their doctrinal systems. The silence that followed was different from the initial silence. It was no longer the silence of compassion or shared mourning, but the silence of intellectual defeat and the recognition that they had encountered something they could not explain or break, a faith that transcended all human categories of understanding. The silence that had settled after the great debates was broken by an unexpected presence. Elihu, son of Barashel the Buzite, of the family of Ram, had been present during the entire discussion, but had remained silent out of respect for the age and position of the other men. He was a young man of imposing appearance, with eyes that blazed with righteous indignation and a posture that radiated the confidence of those who believe they possess insights that had escaped their elders. His anger was directed both at the three friends and at Job himself, but for different reasons. Against the friends, he felt indignation because they had failed to respond adequately to Job's words, allowing apparently blasphemous questionings to remain without proper refutation. Against Job, his anger was because he perceived arrogance in his declarations of innocence and in his subtle questionings of divine justice. "My days are few and you are aged. I was afraid and dared not declare my opinion to you," began Elihu, his voice loaded with a mixture of formal deference and growing confidence. "I said, 'Let days speak and many years teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding.'" It was a bold declaration from a young man who believed he had received divine inspiration that had escaped older and apparently wiser men. Elihu was essentially arguing that age and experience did not guarantee wisdom, and that God could reveal profound truths through younger vessels. Elihu proceeded to develop a more sophisticated theology than that of the three previous friends. Where they had focused primarily on retribution theory, he expanded the discussion to include broader concepts about God's nature and his purposes in human suffering. "Behold, God is great and we know him not. The number of his years is unsearchable," he declared, establishing a theme that would run through all his speeches, the absolute transcendence of God that made human questionings not only inadequate, but fundamentally impossible. He argued that God sometimes allows suffering not as punishment for specific sin, but as means of teaching and purification. He is chastened also with pain on his bed, and with continual strife in his bones, so that his life abhors bread, and his soul dainty food. His flesh is so consumed that it cannot be seen, and his bones that were not seen stick out. It was a more nuanced interpretation of suffering that recognized educative and redemptive purposes, going beyond the simple equation of suffering equals punishment that had dominated previous arguments. As Elihu continued his speeches, a dramatic change began to occur in the atmosphere around the ash heap. The sky, which had been clear during the entire period of debates, began to darken with clouds that formed with supernatural speed. The wind began to blow with increasing intensity, carrying with it a quality that made hair stand on end and hearts beat faster. Elihu, sensitive to atmospheric changes and interpreting them as signs of imminent divine intervention, raised his voice above the growing sound of the wind. "Therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit." It was as if his words were serving as prelude to something much greater that was about to happen. All nature seemed to be preparing for a manifestation that would eclipse all human arguments that had been presented. Then it happened. From the midst of the storm that had formed with supernatural speed, a voice began to speak. Not the voice of any earthly creature, but the voice that had spoken worlds into existence, that had separated light from darkness, that had established the laws governing the cosmos. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? The divine question cut through the storm like lightning, instantly silencing all human arguments that had dominated the air for weeks. It was an interrogation that went straight to the heart of the entire discussion. Human presumption to completely understand divine ways. "Now gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me." God was essentially telling Job to prepare for an interrogation, but an interrogation where God would ask the questions and Job would try to answer. And then came the questions that would completely redefine the perspective of all previous discussion. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Each question was a devastating reminder of the fundamental limitation of human perspective. Job, who had questioned God's ways, was being confronted with his own insignificance before the vastness of creation and divine knowledge. The questions continued, each revealing aspects of creation that were completely beyond human understanding or control. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? God was essentially asking Job if he had any role in establishing or maintaining the fundamental laws governing the universe, from ocean movements to the daily cycle of dawn. The second part of the divine response focused on specific creatures that demonstrated both God's power and wisdom in ways that completely transcended human understanding. Behemoth and Leviathan were presented as examples of divine creation operating according to principles beyond human control or comprehension. Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. The description of Behemoth revealed a creature of massive earthly power, representing forces of nature operating independently of human will. Leviathan was even more impressive. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? It was a creature representing primordial chaos tamed by divine wisdom, but remaining completely beyond human control. Confronted with this overwhelming demonstration of divine greatness and his own limitation, Job finally understood the true nature of his situation. It was not a matter of justice or injustice in human terms, but of a much greater reality where divine wisdom operated in dimensions that completely transcended mortal understanding. Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth, was his first response, a humble recognition that he had no qualification to question or even respond to divine interrogations. When God continued his response, Job finally arrived at complete surrender. I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. It was a total confession of his limitation and a retraction of his previous questionings, not because his sufferings were not real or because he did not have the right to feel them, but because he had come to understand that he was operating with a fundamentally limited perspective. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. The distinction between hearing about God and seeing him directly marked the fundamental transformation that had occurred in Job's understanding. Satan's frustration was palpable, like a dark storm forming around his rebellious presence. For millennia, he had built his identity around the belief that he could understand and manipulate human nature better than his own creator. Worse still was the recognition that God had known Job's heart from the beginning. Divine confidence in his servant had not been a calculated risk, but the absolute certainty of one who sees through superficial appearances to the depths of the human soul. Satan had been used merely as an instrument to demonstrate a truth that God already knew perfectly. The experiment had ended, and faith had triumphed so completely that even evil itself was forced to acknowledge its existence and transformative power.